the second part of my video series looking at the Marvel Famous Covers line from Toy Biz in the mid to late 1990s, I'm going to be turning my attention to the X-Women, or the ladies of the X-Men. As you can see by this lineup, I'll be looking at Jean Grey, Rogue and Psylocke, but I'll also be taking a look at any other figures that I've missed that aren't on display here. So to kick us off, let's start with Jean Grey. Now, of course, the famous cover they've gone with here is X-Men issue number 53, which is actually a fairly significant issue because it was the one that really introduced Onslaught, which was the big villain of the X-Men universe in the mid to late 90s. So I think fans of 90s X-Men comics will recognise this cover and say it's probably one of the more striking ones, and it seems like a pretty decent choice to choose for this version of this costume, for this character, and I think it's a pretty solid choice. And the supporting artwork and images around the box are really bright, colourful and very nicely done. The back of the packaging again has a nice illustrated image here, very nicely coloured, and I think this is a really solid displayable image, and the packaging overall just always looks really solid on these figures. And once again, the presentation when we open that interior flap is pretty solid. We have those two images again with a little bit of information about the character and a particular famous cover, which is great, and of course we have the figure on display in the window packaging there. So overall, I'm a big fan of this packaging. I think it looks really, really good, and this is no exception. But as for the figure itself, I have to say I have mixed feelings towards this one, and I think it's probably one of the weaker ones in the line. There's definitely a few examples we can draw on from this figure where things kind of misfire. First off, and most obviously, is the hair. So, of course, they've gone for the approach of a doll where they've given her sort of, real effect hair. Now, I'm all for this approach. I think when it's used correctly, it can be really, really effective and actually really support the figure and make it look a lot more interesting and lifelike. Here, I think it really hurts the figure, and it probably would have been better to have a more solid piece. As it is, the hair just looks too wiry, too out of place, too wild. It just seems very, very difficult to keep under control, and it just looks messy, silly, and a bit childish. And that's a shame, because I do think the head sculpt and the paint apps on the face are actually really nicely done this time around, and it kind of distracts from that. The other thing they've tried to do is implement two complementary materials to create a slightly different effect, and I don't know whether this works particularly well. So at the shoulders we have this sort of leather effect, very thin leather effect material to look like the shoulder pads, which contrasts against the cotton, the sort of fabric cotton that they have over the rest of the body, and it just looks a bit jarring, doesn't quite work. The mix of styles just looks a little bit disjointed and a bit clunky. You can kind of see this recurring throughout the figure as well. The gauntlets are again made of that soft leather material, which is a very nice material, but it just looks a little bit jarring with the rest of the blue from the main central part of the outfit. Likewise, we have a nice leather belt around the waist, and there's a nice solid plastic X logo here, which is pretty cool, and I like that this is an external piece. I think this works really, really quite well, so that's something in its favour. But then we have these padded pieces on the side of the costume, which again look really jarring and a little bit amateurish because they've been sewn in separately. Again, they just look really disjointed. And this also applies to the hands. Now, thankfully, they haven't gone for the big rubber gloves. They've just opted to paint the hands that are sculpted, which is a really good idea, but it's too bright. The yellow is far too bright for the rest of the costume. Likewise, on the boots of the feet, it just contrasts too strongly against the much brighter yellow of the fabric costume. But that said, in its defense, one thing I do think is really good about this figure is the mold of the feet, because despite being in heels, they balance perfectly well. There's no danger of this figure falling over. It stands very, very well on its own, and that's because there's quite a large surface area on the front of the boot. So this works very, very nicely. The articulation scheme across these figures is pretty much identical, so I'll just run through it once for this video. There is a swivel at the neck, and it's almost a ball jointed neck because the head will swivel from side to side, but it also looks up and down a little bit too, so there's actually a little bit of give there, which is pretty cool. She has ball jointed elbows, so of course those arms kick up and out, which is great, and they can twist from the side. There's a single jointed elbow, and there is a pin swivel at the wrist, so the hand can rotate 360 degrees, and of course it can arc in and out as well. Now, there is also articulation in the waist, which allows the figure to spin from side to side, but also look up and down a good healthy distance as well. So there's no real hindrance to any position you want to put this character in. She has ball jointed hips as well, so the legs kick out to the side, they kick forwards all the way, and they kick backwards a really healthy distance as well. Plus, there is a single jointed knee, and there is another pin swivel at the foot there as well. Overall then, mixed feelings for the Jean Grey figure. I like that they opted to try and keep the style more or less consistent across the X-Men, so they tried to keep with the Jim Lee sort of 90s inspired costumes. But I'll be honest, this has never been my favourite look for Jean Grey, and I think here there's just so many things that sort of work against it. Despite being a very good mould, and despite having great articulation, and it being practically a decent figure, there's just so many things that go wrong and work against it. So the colour scheme is a massive problem. The contrast between the moulded plastic and the colour of the fabric costume, and of course the hair, just really drags it down a few notches, which is a real shame. Moving on to Rogue. Now, this is a figure that took me a good few years to track down. She's fairly scarce and quite a tricky one to pick up. As usual, the presentation and the painting of this front image is really very nicely done. The colours are really pop, they're very vibrant and bright, and the image is very nicely chosen. The famous cover they've gone for, of course, is Rogue One from, I think it's her first limited series, which is a striking cover, and I remember this being very popular in the comic book consciousness at the time. Once again on the reverse we have another illustrated image of Rogue in mid-flight, which looks pretty cool, nicely painted and very displayable. And when we open up the interior inlay again, we have those images there, we have that little bit of bio and information, and of course the window packaging as well. And this just looks really great. I never get tired of looking at these these figures in the packaging, because I just think they look so displayable and just really, really fun to look at. So yeah, top marks for this. And the first thing you'll notice about the figure itself, of course, is that they have gone, for that 90s Jim Lee inspired look, which I think, is probably definitive for Rogue. I think this is the one most people think of when they think of Rogue, so this is awesome. And I think straight away out of the packaging, she's really visually very striking. She's really very colourful and very vibrant, which is fantastic. And I think the head sculpt, whilst it's a little soft, a little toyetic, I do think they've really captured the essence of the character, that sort of no-nonsense attitude that Rogue brings. So I quite like that she's sort of in a stifled scream. I'm not overly keen on the teeth because it's just one solid white mass. It would have been better if there'd been sort of a line drawn across that to indicate that they are teeth, because it looks a bit strange without. And again, you will see that, of course, they've opted to give her real doll hair, which I think this time works really well. Part of that is because it's aided by the material bandana at the top of her head, which looks really nice. The fact that the hair sort of comes out of that and is neat and orderly is really important. And it is helped because it is tied together with a plastic sleeve to keep its shape and keep it looking pretty good. And I think if you do that, then this is actually really effective, and I think this looks really good. And it's nice that they've got the silver strand running through it as well. So overall, I'm really quite happy with this. I really love the leather effect jacket they've given it. Like the Gambit in the previous video, it's a nice, thick, luxurious sort of leather effect material, but it works really, really well. And it adds a nice texture to the figure because it's a really fun look, and this works really well. One thing I would point out is that I've noticed on some production photos and some in-hand footage as well, some people tend to have the X symbol on her chest. Mine doesn't have that. I wasn't sure whether they did two variants or whether mine's just misprint or what happened, whether theirs is a special one, I don't know. But I have seen, seems to be two versions of this figure, and mine doesn't have it. And I did get it brand new, so I don't know what happened there, but if you've got the X on the chest, then that's even better. I also really like that they've given her this separate belt piece, which is really cool because it is kind of a big loop, just like in the comics, where you can angle it so it angles sort of dangles to one side, which is pretty cool. And again, it's a nice rubber piece, nicely painted with the X logo there, which is cool. And you may notice they've done something slightly different this time. They've given her thigh-high boots, but they are, again, a soft, thin leather effect material, and they've even got a nice green trim of cotton running around them. So this looks actually really quite good and is more effective than you might realise. And as you can see, these slide over the moulded plastic boots at the bottom, which works really quite well. And you might notice these are slightly different mould to the Jean Grey. As a result, I would warn you that she's not quite as sturdy on her feet, and balance can sometimes be an issue. Now, I love this figure. I think they've done a really nice job. I think the overall presentation is really solid. I think the colours on the costume are really nice, and the materials they've used are really complementary to the figure overall. So it looks fairly consistent, and it looks fun and dynamic, and just everything it should be, and it doesn't ever look silly or too much. Next up, we have Psylocke. Once again, the image they've chosen there is really, really solid. I love the colour scheme that they've gone for with the blue and the purple, and I really like the design of the X with the side blade running through it. I think that's a really nice touch. The famous cover they've gone for is X-Men issue 6, and yeah, I think this again is a pretty solid choice. I remember this cover being very strong and vibrant and being kind of cool at the time, and of course Psylocke is up front and centre there, so yeah, I think this is pretty striking, and I think they've chosen wisely. Here's the reverse of the packaging, and once again we have a unique image here, which is pretty cool, very striking, very visual, and yeah, very displayable. And inside we have the interior artwork, a little bit of information there, and of course we can see the figure in the window display. One thing you might notice is that sometimes in this series they would have sub-series or figures that would be collected by different groups, and for some reason this one seems to come under Marvel Divas, which is a bit strange since a lot of these others were under Children of the Atom for the X-Men or whatever it might be, so a bit unusual, and I don't think they had an awful lot in this category. So out of the packaging, of course, we can see they once again base this on the Jim Lee early 90s look for Psylocke, which has always been pretty much a constant really since those days. There have been little variations in the years since, but this is pretty definitive of what we think of as Psylocke, I think. Now, if I was going to be critical, I think when it comes to the head sculpt, I've got a couple of issues with it. It does look very toyetic. It's definitely, the features are very, very soft, and obviously they're slightly wrong because, you know, Psylocke obviously has Asian features, and here she looks very Western. So this doesn't really look like the character we see in the front of the packaging. That said, I do think the expression they've gone for on the face is kind of perfect in the sense that, you know, it's capturing the essence of the character, which is, you know, tough, inquisitive, but a little bit sultry as well. So I think this is nicely done. And once again, the hair is excellently maintained here, so whereas this could have been a disaster, as it was a little bit in my opinion with Jean Grey, here it works really very nicely. So her hair's kept in that ponytail, it's long flowing, and it looks nice and neat, and this is an example of where it works really, really well and supports the figure overall because it's shiny, it's glossy, and it's visually very interesting. For the central part of the costume, I've got slightly mixed feelings here because some of it is done really, really well. So I really like the leather effect that we've got for the arms, for the central corset piece, and the bandages going around the legs. I think this looks really good. It looks tight-fitting. It looks like it does in the comic books, and that's what it's all about. So I think this material is quite a nice texture as well, and it works really well. It comes together to support the overall presentation of the figure, which is great. Now, the red band around the waist, it looks a little bit too chunky for my liking, a little bit too thick, but it looks nice. I think they've done a decent job with it, so I'm not complaining about that too much. But what does really let this figure down is the fact that they've kind of gone for a skin tone for the rest of the figure. So rather than having these individual pieces just on the arms of the figure or on the body of the figure, they've opted to make it all one costume. So as a result, we have this sort of skin tone knitted quality to what should be the shoulders and the thighs, and it doesn't look like skin tone. It's incongruous against the head and the hands in terms of the skin colour, and it just looks a little bit jarring and a bit off-putting. So I wish they hadn't done that, to be honest. However, I am really pleased at the choice they've gone for the feet, because this time, rather than having that moulded heel, they've gone for a flat foot, and this works really very well, certainly in terms of balance, but also I think it's more in keeping with the ninja style of the character. So this looks really cool. It allows the feet, rather than having those big clunky boots that we've seen on some of the male characters, and without having the heel of some of the female ones, she's allowed to stand freely, and it looks good because the boots are that soft leather material. It just looks well fitted and appropriate, and it just works. I thought I'd also point out how inconsistent these figures are when it comes to the head articulation in particular, because as we can see here with Psylocke, she can look a really healthy distance from side to side and up and down. Like, there's no limits to this, which is brilliant. But something worth pointing out is this leather material is nice, it's managed to stay fresh across all the years, but when you bend it, it is liable to sort of crack and create these little seams. I don't know if you can notice that, but when it's flat, no problem. When you bend it, you can see it splits a little bit, which looks a little bit unsightly, and I would worry over time, if this is on display for a long time, that it would start to crack. But as an extra, Psylocke is one of the few characters in this line that actually comes with an accessory, and this of course is her Psy blade with sort of a Psy effect going around it. There's two elastic bands that can be strapped to her arm to make it look like she's holding it. It's not entirely effective, but that said, when you put it on display like this, from the right angle, it looks pretty cool, I have to say. And if you put a light behind it or whatever, it would shine up quite nicely, and despite being such a simple and slightly clunky idea, it actually is surprisingly effective, and I'm actually really quite fond of this. So, who else have I missed? Because there was, of course, another X-Man or X-Lady that we didn't look at in this video so far, and that is, of course, Storm. Now, sadly, we're going to have to rely on some production photos and different photos I've been able to scour the internet for, because sadly, I never owned this figure or any of the variants, and it's still one that I'm trying to track down to this day. So this was a standard mass retail release. The first thing you'll probably notice about this, of course, is that this is Storm from the early 70s Chris Claremont run. So this is her costume as it was then, so obviously out of touch with what we've seen in the collection so far otherwise, which is obviously very inspired by the Jim Lee run. I think this is probably a pretty smart choice to go for, in the sense that it's the most iconic costume. I think this is, again, is one of those costumes that a lot of people do tend to think of as Storm wearing, and it's certainly got a really nice, interesting visual quality to it. The outer packaging once again looks really nice. They've chosen a really solid famous cover as well to go for, which is great, and I think the effect of the lightning and everything just looks really cool. And the figure itself looks pretty awesome as well. Of course, has that big cloak that wraps around the wrists there, which I think would be really fun. Obviously, they've opted for the real hair effect again with the hair plate as well, which is cool. And there's even like a metal link to hold the costume together in the centre. I've noticed that they're obviously using the leather and knee-high effect boot look, which is pretty cool. And I think overall, the presentation of this figure looks pretty solid. Now, there's a couple of photos I can find online of what this might look like in real life, and they're not quite as impressive, but I do think that, this is probably a pretty strong entry in the line. But this wasn't the only Storm figure they released. They did do another two variants, and they came as part of a 2-pack which was released as a special limited edition to tie in with the release of the first X-Men film. And as you can see from the packaging here, there's a slightly different attempt they've gone for here in terms of the style. Obviously, they've tried to map it to their packaging that they had for the X-Men film, which is that sort of bluey, grey sort of metal effect running around the outer packaging, but they've kept the artistic illustration for the 90s version of Storm on the left-hand side, whilst using a production photo for the right-hand side, which is, of course, based on the film. And when the exterior window flaps are opened, on the inside we can see the figures on display here. And we can see on the left hand side we have what they're calling Classic Storm, but of course, as we know, this again is based on the Jim Lee 90s version of the character, which is more consistent with the rest of the figures in this line, so kind of makes it a bit of a must. Whilst on the right hand side we have the movie version of Storm, of course, as played by Halle Berry. Now, it's very difficult judging from a photo like this, which is in packaging, and without seeing it in hand, it's often a difficult judgment call to make. I do think the Classic Storm looks well made. Again, we have the cape there, which I think would be really fun. We've got those, the leather effect knee-high boots, I think, and there's some nice details with the X logo buttons on the shoulders there. But other than that, it does look a little bit bland because it is all white. I've never been a huge fan of this version of the costume, in truth, mainly because it does lack a lot of colour, which is a shame, but nevertheless, it looks like it's well done, but I think the star of the set is probably the movie version, which looks a lot more interesting. Now, again, I don't have it in hand, but I am assuming that that costume is made from a leather effect throughout it, and again, it must have the cape there as well, which would be pretty cool to see in hand. And I like the silver trim that's running through it, and also, again, the accurate hairstyle, and I think the head sculpt as well looks to be pretty decent from here. So yeah, this is one that I would really like to get my hands on, but never have, sadly. So there you have it, there is my whistle-stop tour of the women of the X-Men that were made for the Marvel Famous Covers line by Toy Biz. I have to say in the main, I really like these figures. I think in particular, the Rogue is probably the standout one in my opinion. I think just everything about that figure just comes together really well to make it pretty much pitch perfect. And then I'd probably follow that up with the Psylocke as well, because I think despite there being an odd choice with the bodysuits, overall, everything else about the figure really works quite nicely, and yeah, it looks really nice on display. Now, the Jean Grey isn't a disaster, I just wish they'd made certain other artistic choices to bring it to life. But all in all, a pretty nice collection, very toyetic collection, a really fun, colourful set of toys. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.